Hello there, and welcome back to Rocked History. I'm your host, and before we dive into tonight's story, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. Whether you're listening during your morning commute, taking a break from work, or settling in for the night, I appreciate you choosing to spend your time with us. If you're new to the channel, welcome to the community. We explore stories of survival, conflict, and the extraordinary things ordinary people do when pushed to their absolute limits. If you find yourself drawn into what you're about to hear, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. And for those of you who've been with us from the beginning, your support means everything. Now, let's get into tonight's story, and I promise you, this one will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last word that he checked in alone. They checked out in body bags. This is the story of a man who wanted nothing more than to disappear, to fade into the background of American life like a ghost passing through the walls of the living. But some men carry their past like a shadow, and no matter how far they run, no matter how deeply they hide, that shadow eventually catches up with them. This is the story of Thomas Reed, though that wasn't the name he was using when he checked into the Desert Star Motel on that hot June evening. To understand what happened in that motel over the course of one long, blood-soaked night, we need to go back to the beginning, to understand who Thomas Reed really was, what he'd done, and why 5 professional killers made the fatal mistake of thinking he was just another target. The Desert Star Motel sat on a forgotten stretch of highway in western Arizona, the kind of place that exists in the gaps between civilization, where the desert reaches out and swallows everything that isn't strong enough to resist it. It was a single-story structure built sometime in the 1960s, back when this highway had been the main route between Phoenix and Las Vegas, before the interstate had been built and siphoned off all the traffic, leaving places like the Desert Star to slowly die in the heat and dust. The motel had 12 rooms arranged in an L shape around a parking lot where weeds grew through cracks in the asphalt. There was an office with a flickering neon sign that buzzed like a dying insect, a vending machine that hadn't worked in years, and a swimming pool that had been drained and filled with sand and debris. The whole place had the feeling of abandonment, of time having moved on and left it behind. The owner was a man named Harold Vickers, 73 years old, with skin like leather from decades in the Arizona sun and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. Harold had bought the motel 30 years ago, back when he'd retired from the Marines, thinking it would be an easy way to make a living. But the interstate had opened 2 years later, and business had dried up almost overnight. Now Harold kept the place running mostly out of stubbornness, refusing to admit defeat, surviving on the occasional trucker who took a wrong turn and the rare traveler who preferred the old highways to the efficient monotony of the interstate. He lived in a small apartment behind the office, spent his days watching television and his nights listening to the desert wind howl through the empty parking lot. On this particular June evening, Harold was sitting behind the counter in the office, a fan blowing hot air around the room, when he heard a vehicle pull into the parking lot. He looked up from his crossword puzzle, surprised because he hadn't had a customer in 3 days. Through the window, he could see a dusty Ford pickup truck, maybe 10 years old, nothing special about it except that it was clean and well-maintained despite the desert dust coating it. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Harold had developed an instinct over the years for reading people, for figuring out in the first few seconds whether they were going to be trouble or not. Most people who came through here were either lost or running from something, and you could usually tell which by the way they carried themselves. This man was different. He moved with an economy of motion, nothing wasted, nothing hurried. He was maybe 45 years old, medium height, medium build, the kind of man you could look at and forget 5 minutes later. He wore jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, work boots that had seen some miles. His hair was brown going to gray, cut short. No visible tattoos, no jewelry except for a cheap digital watch. His face was weathered but unremarkable, the kind of face that belonged to a construction worker or a long-haul trucker or any one of 1,000 blue-collar jobs. But it was the eyes that made Harold pause. Even from across the parking lot, even through the office window, Harold could see those eyes, and they reminded him of eyes he'd seen before, back in the Marines, back in Vietnam. They were the eyes of a man who'd seen combat, who'd done things and had things done to him, who'd been to the edge and looked over and somehow made it back. Harold had learned to recognize those eyes, and he recognized them now. The man walked into the office, and Harold noticed he moved without making much sound, his footsteps soft despite the work boots. Up close, Harold could see the details he'd missed from a distance. The man had scars, old ones, mostly hidden by his clothes but visible on his forearms and the side of his neck. Not the kind of scars you got from a car accident or a workplace injury, but the kind that came from knives and shrapnel. His hands were calloused but clean, and when he put them on the counter, Harold saw they were the hands of someone who knew how to use them for more than just honest work. The man asked for a room, his voice quiet and neutral, no accent that Harold could place. He paid in cash, counting out the bills from a worn wallet that contained nothing else except more cash and a driver's license. Harold glanced at the license, saw it was from New Mexico, saw the name was David Martinez. He didn't believe for a second that was the man's real name, but Harold had learned a long time ago not to ask questions he didn't want answered. He handed over the key to room 7, the room farthest from the office, at the end of the short leg of the L. The man thanked him, took the key, and left without another word. Harold watched through the window as the man, who'd called himself David Martinez but who we know was really Thomas Reed, drove his truck to room 7 and parked directly in front of the door. He sat in the truck for a moment, and Harold saw him scanning the parking lot, the road, the desert beyond, his head moving in small, precise increments like a camera. Then he got out, went to the truck bed, and pulled out a single duffel bag. He unlocked the door to room 7, went inside, and a moment later Harold saw the curtains close. That was it. No requesting extra towels, no asking about restaurants or gas stations, no small talk. Just a man checking into a motel room and closing the door behind him. Harold went back to his crossword puzzle, but something was nagging at him, some instinct telling him that the quiet man in room 7 was going to be trouble. Not the kind of trouble that started fights in the parking lot or trashed rooms or skipped out on the bill. Something else. Something worse. Harold had survived Vietnam and 30 years of running a dying motel by trusting his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that whatever was about to happen, he wanted no part of it. Inside room 7, Thomas Reed stood in the center of the space and conducted a systematic evaluation of his environment, something he'd done so many times in so many rooms that it was as automatic as breathing. The room was exactly what he'd expected, a double bed with a faded comforter, a nightstand with a lamp that barely worked, a small table with 2 chairs, a bathroom with cracked tiles and a shower that probably had terrible water pressure, a television bolted to a dresser, curtains that were thick enough to block the light but thin enough to tear easily. There was one window looking out on the parking lot, one door with a deadbolt and a chain lock, no connecting doors to adjacent rooms. The walls were thin enough that he'd hear anyone moving in the rooms on either side, though from what he'd seen in the parking lot, those rooms were empty. Thomas set his duffel bag on the bed and unzipped it, taking inventory of what he'd brought with him. 2 changes of clothes. A first aid kit. Water purification tablets. Energy bars. A burner phone with prepaid minutes. A laptop that had been scrubbed clean of any identifying information. $5,000 in cash in small bills. A Glock 19 with 3 spare magazines. A K-bar knife. A small collection of lock picks and electronic bypass tools. Everything he needed to disappear, to survive, to defend himself if it came to that. He'd been running for 8 months now, ever since the job in Caracas had gone sideways and he'd realized that the people who'd hired him had decided he knew too much, had become a liability, had to be eliminated. Thomas had worked in the intelligence community for 23 years, first as a Marine, then as a CIA paramilitary operations officer, and finally as a contractor doing the kind of work that governments needed done but couldn't officially acknowledge. He'd operated in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, and a dozen other places that never appeared in his official travel records. He'd killed men in ways that ranged from clean headshots at 600 yards to messy close-quarters knife work in dark alleys. He'd interrogated prisoners, run informant networks, planned and executed operations that had changed the course of wars in small but significant ways, and then he'd gotten old. Not old in the way normal people got old, with retirement parties and grandchildren and a house in the suburbs. Old in the way operators got old, where your reflexes slowed by fractions of a second, where you started hesitating before pulling the trigger, where you woke up in the middle of the night with your heart racing and your hand reaching for a gun that wasn't there. Old in the way that made your employers start to wonder if you were still reliable, if you could still be trusted to do the work without asking questions or developing a conscience. The Caracas job should have been straightforward. Extract a cartel accountant who decided to cooperate with the DEA, get him across the border into Colombia, hand him off to the handlers who'd take him the rest of the way to the States. Thomas had done 100 operations like it, and this one should have been easier than most. But when he'd arrived at the safe house where the accountant was waiting, he'd found the man already dead, killed execution style with 2 bullets to the back of the head. And he'd found evidence that suggested the accountant hadn't just been killed by the cartel he betrayed, but by the same people who'd hired Thomas to extract him. That's when Thomas had understood. The whole operation had been a setup, a way to tie up a loose end. The accountant had known too much about who was really funding certain cartel operations, about which American officials were on which payrolls, about money that flowed in directions it wasn't supposed to flow. And Thomas, by accepting the job, had become part of that loose end. The people who'd hired him hadn't expected him to extract the accountant, because they'd already made sure the accountant would be dead when Thomas arrived. What they'd expected was for Thomas to be there when the cartel sicarios showed up, for him to be killed along with the accountant, for both problems to be solved with one violent incident in a country where violent incidents were common enough that no one would ask too many questions. But Thomas had survived because he'd been doing this kind of work long enough to recognize a trap when he walked into one. He'd seen the accountant's body, seen how fresh the blood was, realized he had maybe 5 minutes before the people who'd killed the accountant came back to make sure there were no witnesses. So he'd run, had barely made it out of the building before he heard the vehicles arriving, had disappeared into the chaos of Caracas's streets and then across the border and eventually back to the United States, traveling on false documents, paying cash for everything, trusting no one. For 8 months, he'd been moving from place to place, never staying more than a few days anywhere, always paying cash, always using false names, always watching for any sign that he'd been found. He'd liquidated everything he could liquidate, turned bank accounts into cash, abandoned his apartment and his car and anything else that could be traced to his real identity. Thomas Reed had effectively ceased to exist, replaced by a series of temporary identities that he cycled through like a man changing clothes. He'd chosen the Desert Star Motel because it was exactly the kind of place where no one asked questions and no one remembered faces. He'd planned to stay 1 night, maybe 2, then move on to the next anonymous motel in the next forgettable town. In a few more months, if he was careful, if he was lucky, maybe the people hunting him would give up, would decide he'd died somewhere and his body just hadn't been found, would move on to other problems and other targets. Maybe he could stop running. Maybe he could find some small town somewhere and start over with a new name and a new life. But deep down, Thomas knew that was a fantasy. Men like him didn't retire. They didn't get to start over. They just kept running until the day they couldn't run anymore, until their luck finally ran out and the past caught up with them. And sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, Thomas wondered if it wouldn't be easier to just stop running, to let whatever was coming find him, to get it over with one way or another. He checked the Glock, made sure it was loaded and the safety was off, then placed it on the nightstand within easy reach of the bed. He did a final check of the room, making sure the door was locked, the chain was in place, the curtains were completely closed. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and allowed himself to relax slightly, knowing that he needed sleep, that running on adrenaline and energy bars wasn't sustainable, that sooner or later his body would demand rest whether he wanted to give it or not. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, shadows growing long across the empty parking lot. The temperature was dropping from unbearable to merely uncomfortable, the dry heat of the day giving way to the cool of the desert night. Inside the motel office, Harold Vickers was locking up for the evening, preparing to retreat to his apartment and his television and his microwave dinner, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in his gut ever since the quiet man had checked into room 7. And on the highway, still 20 miles away, 3 vehicles were approaching the Desert Star Motel. 2 black SUVs and a silver sedan, driving in formation, maintaining careful spacing. Inside those vehicles were 5 men who'd been given a job, a target, a location. They'd been told that a man named Thomas Reed would be at this motel, that he was alone and isolated, that he needed to be eliminated quietly and efficiently, that there could be no mistakes and no witnesses. They'd been told that Reed was dangerous, that he'd been trained by the best, that he wouldn't go down easily. But they'd also been told that he was on the run, that he was tired and paranoid and jumpy, that he'd be expecting them and that would make him vulnerable, because a man who's always looking over his shoulder eventually stops looking where he's going. The 5 men in those 3 vehicles were professionals, contractors hired through the same shadowy networks that had once employed Thomas Reed himself. They had military backgrounds, special operations experience, they'd done this kind of work before. They had detailed intelligence on their target, photographs, known aliases, vehicle descriptions, a complete profile of his training and capabilities. They had weapons, body armor, communications equipment, everything they needed to do the job. They were confident, maybe even a little bored, because no matter how dangerous the target was supposed to be, it was still just 1 man against 5, and those were odds that any professional would take. What they didn't know, what the people who'd hired them hadn't told them or maybe didn't know themselves, was that Thomas Reed had spent his entire adult life preparing for a moment like this. Every mission he'd ever run, every firefight he'd ever survived, every close call and narrow escape had taught him something. He'd learned to read environments, to spot threats before they materialized, to plan for contingencies within contingencies. He'd learned that surviving wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest or even the best shot. It was about being the most prepared, the most aware, the most willing to do whatever it took. The 3 vehicles pulled off the highway onto the road that led to the Desert Star Motel. Inside the lead SUV, the team leader, a man named Marcus Webb, was going over the plan one final time with his team. Webb was 42 years old, former Delta Force, with 16 years of experience in special operations and private military contracting. He'd done jobs like this in Iraq, Afghanistan, Colombia, Mexico, half a dozen African countries. He was good at his job, methodical and professional, the kind of man who treated killing as a technical problem to be solved with the right combination of planning and execution. Webb's team consisted of 4 other men. In the lead SUV with him was his second-in-command, a man named Jake Russo, former Navy SEAL, 37 years old, known for his proficiency with long-range shooting and his ability to stay calm under pressure. In the second SUV were 2 more operators, Chen Lu, former Marine Raider, 34 years old, an expert in close-quarters combat and breaching techniques, and David Moore, former Army Ranger, 39 years old, a communications specialist who also served as the team's medic. In the silver sedan, driving alone, was the 5th member of the team, a man named Viktor Kozlov, 45 years old, former Russian Spetsnaz who defected to the West during the 90s and had been working as a contractor ever since. Kozlov's job was to provide overwatch, to position himself somewhere with a good view of the target location and provide early warning if anything went wrong. Webb had planned the operation like he planned every operation, with careful attention to detail and multiple backup plans. They'd approached the motel after dark, when there would be minimal visibility and maximum confusion. Kozlov would set up in a position overlooking the motel, probably on a small rise about 300 yards to the north where he'd have clear sightlines to all the rooms and the parking lot. The other 4 would move in on foot, approaching room 7 from different angles, ready to breach simultaneously. The goal was to be quick and violent, to hit Reed before he had time to react, to be in and out in less than 5 minutes. They'd been told to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, to take Reed's money and his vehicle, to leave his body in the room and be 50 miles away before anyone found it. The motel was isolated enough that no one would hear gunshots, and from what Webb had learned about the owner, Harold Vickers was a 73-year-old man who would almost certainly stay in his apartment and mind his own business even if he did hear something. By the time the police investigated, Webb and his team would be long gone, and the investigation would go nowhere because there would be no evidence connecting them to the scene. That it was a good plan. Webb had run operations with worse odds and more complications. This should be straightforward, almost boring. One target, isolated location, element of surprise on their side. The fact that the target was Thomas Reed, a former operator with a reputation for being extremely difficult to kill, did give Webb some pause. He'd made sure his team understood that Reed wasn't some amateur, that he'd have training and skills that would make him dangerous even when cornered. But Webb also knew that Reed had been on the run for months, that he was tired and paranoid and probably not thinking as clearly as he would have been under better circumstances. And no matter how good Reed had once been, he was still just one man against 5 professionals who knew exactly where he was and what he was doing. The 3 vehicles slowed as they approached the Desert Star Motel, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. Webb could see the motel's neon sign flickering in the distance, could see the L-shaped building and the mostly empty parking lot. He counted the vehicles: Harold's old pickup truck parked near the office, and one other vehicle, a Ford pickup, parked in front of room 7 at the far end of the motel. That would be Reed's truck. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Webb keyed his radio, spoke quietly to his team. They'd drive past the motel, continue down the road for about a mile, then turn around and come back with their lights off. Kozlov would drop off first, take his gear, and hike up to his overwatch position. The 2 SUVs would park on the side of the road about 200 yards from the motel, and the 4-man assault team would approach on foot. Simple, efficient, professional. Inside room 7, Thomas Reed was lying on the bed, fully clothed, his boots still on, the Glock within easy reach on the nightstand. He wasn't asleep. He couldn't remember the last time he'd actually slept properly, the kind of deep, restful sleep where you woke up feeling refreshed. Instead, he'd developed the ability to rest in a state of semi-consciousness, his mind hovering just below the surface of wakefulness, aware of his surroundings even while his body recovered from the constant stress of being on the run. He heard the vehicles go past on the highway, heard the change in engine note as they slowed slightly. 3 vehicles, traveling together, slowing down as they passed the motel. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just travelers looking for a place to stay and deciding this place looked too run down. Or maybe it was exactly what Thomas had been expecting for 8 months, the moment when his luck finally ran out and the people hunting him finally caught up. Thomas sat up, moved to the window, carefully pulled back the curtain just enough to see out. The highway was dark, no headlights visible in either direction. But his instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive through 2 decades of operations in the world's most dangerous places, were screaming at him. Something was wrong. Something was coming. That he moved quickly, years of training taking over, muscle memory guiding his actions. He checked the Glock again, chambered around, tucked it into his waistband. He grabbed the duffel bag, pulled out the spare magazines, put them in his pockets. The K-bar knife went into a sheath on his belt. He looked around the room, evaluating it not as a place to sleep but as a potential battlefield. 1 door, 1 window, thin walls, minimal cover. It was a terrible place to defend, which meant he couldn't stay here. If they were coming, and his instincts told him they were, he needed to move before they arrived, needed to find a better position, needed to turn the situation to his advantage. Thomas went to the bathroom, grabbed the thin towels, and stuffed them against the gap at the bottom of the door, blocking the light from inside. He turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Then he moved to the window, opened it slowly, quietly, blessing the fact that the old motel's windows were the kind that slid open rather than the modern sealed units that would have made noise. He looked out, scanning the parking lot, the road beyond, the desert darkness. Nothing moved. But they were out there. He could feel it. That he climbed through the window, lowering himself to the ground outside, moving with practiced silence. Once outside, he closed the window most of the way, leaving it just slightly open. Then he moved quickly away from room 7, staying low, using the vehicles in the parking lot for cover, heading toward the short leg of the L-shaped building where the empty rooms would give him options. About 300 yards away, Viktor Kozlov was settling into his overwatch position on the small rise that gave him a clear view of the Desert Star Motel. He had a suppressed rifle with a night vision scope, a radio, and a pair of high-end binoculars. He scanned the motel systematically, noting the office where a light was on, the old man visible through the window, and room 7 where the curtains were closed but he could see a faint light around the edges. The target was inside, probably settling in for the night, probably thinking he was safe for at least a few more hours. Kozlov reported his position to Webb, confirmed he had good visibility, said the target appeared to be inside room 7 and there was no indication he was aware of the incoming assault team. Webb acknowledged, told Kozlov to maintain overwatch and report any changes. Then Webb, Russo, Lou, and more began their approach to the motel, moving on foot through the darkness, night vision goggles turning the desert landscape into shades of green, weapons at the ready. They moved well, these 4 men, with the practiced coordination of professionals who trained together and worked together on multiple operations. They spread out, approaching room 7 from different angles, ready to converge simultaneously on Webb's signal. Webb had his rifle up, scanning the window and door of room 7 through his night vision, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that Reed had detected them. He saw nothing. The curtains were closed, the room was quiet, everything looked normal. Webb keyed his radio, whispered to his team. On his signal, Lou would breach the door while Moore covered him. Russo would be ready to engage through the window if needed. Webb himself would be primary entry, first through the door, ready to put Reed down before the target could react. It was a standard room clearing procedure, the kind of thing they'd all done hundreds of times in training and dozens of times in real operations. 3. 2. 1. Breach. Lou moved to the door, positioned the battering ram, and drove it into the frame just below the handle. The door exploded inward, the old wood splintering, the cheap lock giving way immediately. Moore was right behind him, both men flowing into the room with their weapons up, scanning for targets. Webb was third through the door, his rifle sweeping across the small space, finger on the trigger, ready to fire. The room was empty, not just empty of people, but obviously empty, the bed still made, the duffel bag gone, the window open. Webb felt his stomach drop, felt the tactical situation shift in a fundamental way. Reed wasn't here. Which meant Reed had known they were coming, had detected them somehow, was out there somewhere in the darkness, armed and dangerous and with every advantage of knowing the terrain while they were exposed and illuminated by the lights from inside the room. Webb was already moving, already shouting into his radio for his team to fall back, to get out of the room and the kill zone, but it was too late. The night erupted with gunfire, not from inside the room but from outside, from somewhere in the darkness beyond the parking lot. Thomas Reed had found himself a position with a good field of fire and had waited for them to breach the room, waited for them to be backlit by the lights and grouped together in the fatal funnel of the doorway, waited for the perfect moment to strike. His first shots took Moore in the chest, the body armor stopping the bullets but the kinetic impact throwing the man backward, taking him out of the fight. His second burst caught Lou as the man tried to dive for cover, bullets hitting him in the side where the armor didn't protect, dropping him hard to the pavement. Webb and Russo managed to get behind cover, Webb behind his vehicle and Russo behind a concrete pillar near the office, both men trying to locate the shooter, trying to return fire, but shooting at nothing because they couldn't see where the muzzle flashes were coming from. In his overwatch position, Kozlov heard the gunfire and swung his rifle around, scanning through his scope, trying to find the target. He saw the chaos in the parking lot, saw Moore down and Lou wounded, saw Webb and Russo pinned behind cover. But he couldn't see Reed, couldn't find the shooter, and without a clear shot, he was useless. Thomas Reed was shooting from a prone position behind a low wall about 50 yards from the motel, a spot he'd identified during his brief reconnaissance before taking his position. He had good cover, a good angle on the parking lot, and the advantage of having prepared for this moment while his attackers were still reacting to the fact that their operation had gone sideways. He'd counted 4 men entering the motel, which meant there had to be at least one more, probably providing overwatch from a distance. He needed to deal with the immediate threats first, then worry about the overwatch position that he shifted his aim, put 3 rounds through the windshield of the vehicle Webb was hiding behind, not expecting to hit the man but forcing him to move, to make a decision, to do something other than just hunker down and wait for backup. Webb moved, rolling away from the vehicle and making for better cover near the office, and Thomas tracked him with his sights, fired twice more, missed both times because Webb was moving fast and the light was bad and you couldn't hit everything even when you were good. Russo tried to return fire from behind his pillar, long controlled bursts that would have been effective if he'd known where his target was, but since he was shooting blind, all he accomplished was wasting ammunition and giving away his position. Thomas adjusted his aim, compensated for distance and wind, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet hit Russo in the throat, just above the body armor, and the man went down hard, his weapon clattering to the pavement, his hands going to his neck in an instinctive and futile attempt to stop the bleeding. In the office, Harold Vickers was crouched behind the counter, his hands over his head, wondering what the hell was happening and why he'd ever thought buying a motel was a good idea. He could hear gunfire, a lot of it, and the sound of men shouting and vehicles starting. He'd been in Vietnam, he knew what a firefight sounded like, and this was definitely a firefight, which meant he was staying exactly where he was until someone told him it was safe to move. Webb had made it to better cover, a dumpster near the side of the building, and he was assessing the situation, trying to figure out his next move. Moore was down but probably alive, his armor had taken the hits. Lou was wounded, still moving but not combat effective. Russo was dead or dying. Webb had seen the way he went down, had seen enough men die to recognize it. Which left Webb alone and pinned down by a target who had better position, better preparation, and apparently no intention of making mistakes. Webb keyed his radio, called for Kozlov, demanded to know why the Overwatch wasn't engaging the target. Kozlov's response was tense, frustrated. He couldn't get a clear shot, couldn't even locate the target precisely, the shooter was using cover too effectively and there wasn't enough light even with night vision. Webb swore, made a decision. They needed to abort, needed to get out before this got any worse, needed to get back to the vehicles and leave before law enforcement showed up. He told Kozlov to provide covering fire, told Moore to get up and move if he could, told Lou to do the same, but Thomas Reed had no intention of letting them leave. These men had come here to kill him, and he was going to make sure they regretted it. He shifted position, moving quickly to a new spot before anyone could pinpoint his location, and when Moore tried to get up and run for one of the SUVs, Thomas was ready. He fired 3 times, aiming low, going for the legs because Moore's armor would stop chest shots. 2 of the bullets hit, and Moore went down again, screaming, clutching his shattered knee. Lou tried to provide covering fire, tried to give Moore a chance to drag himself to safety, but Lou was wounded and in pain and his shots were wild, hitting nothing. Thomas targeted him next, took his time with the shot because Lou wasn't moving much, and put a bullet through the man's head, ending him instantly. That left Webb and Moore, plus Kozlov somewhere out in the darkness. 3 against 1, but Thomas had momentum now, had control of the situation, and he intended to press that advantage. He moved again, circling around toward the vehicles, staying low and fast, using every scrap of cover. His goal was to get to one of the SUVs, to either disable them or use them for cover, to prevent the surviving attackers from escaping easily. Webb saw him moving, caught a glimpse of motion in the darkness, and fired, but Thomas was already behind cover again, and Webb's shots hit nothing but dirt and concrete. Webb made his own decision then, decided that survival was more important than completing the mission, that he needed to get out of here right now before the situation got any worse. He ran for the nearest SUV, firing blindly behind him to discourage pursuit, moving as fast as he could while expecting at any moment to feel the impact of bullets hitting him. He made it to the SUV, dove inside, turned the key that was already in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and Webb threw the vehicle into gear, stomped on the accelerator. Tires screamed on the pavement, and the SUV lurched forward, heading for the exit of the parking lot and the road beyond. Webb didn't look back, didn't check on Moore or worry about Kozlov. His only thought was getting away, getting distance, getting somewhere safe where he could Wrong. Thomas watched the SUV race away, considered shooting at it but decided against it. He'd rather have one of them escape and spread the word about what happened here, let whoever had sent these men know that Thomas Reed wasn't an easy target, that coming after him had a price. Instead, he turned his attention to Moore, who was still alive, still in the parking lot, wounded but conscious. Thomas approached carefully, his weapon up, scanning for threats, making sure this wasn't some kind of trap. But Moore was finished, his knee destroyed, bleeding heavily, his rifle lost somewhere in the chaos. When Thomas stood over him, Moore looked up with eyes that were equal parts pain and resignation. He knew what was coming. Men in their profession always knew. Thomas asked him one question: "Who sent you?" Moore hesitated, and Thomas asked again, more forcefully, and this time Moore answered. He gave up a name, a contact, a phone number. He probably shouldn't have, probably violated a dozen rules about operational security, but Moore was dying and he knew it, and maybe he figured that if he was going out, he might as well give Reed something to work with, might as well cause problems for the people who'd sent him on this botched operation. When Moore finished talking, Thomas thanked him, genuinely, and then put a bullet in his head. It was quick, professional, the kind of clean death that operators gave each other when there was no other choice. Then Thomas moved quickly, methodically, through the parking lot, checking the bodies, collecting weapons and ammunition and anything else that might be useful. Russo was dead, as was Lou. Their gear went into a pile that Thomas planned to load into his truck. He looked around, evaluating the scene. The whole thing had taken maybe 5 minutes from start to finish. The motel's parking lot looked like a war zone, bodies and spent shell casings and blood. The office door opened, and Harold Vickers emerged, moving slowly, his hands visible, his expression a mixture of shock and resignation. Thomas looked at him, and Harold looked back, and there was a moment of understanding between two old soldiers who'd both seen too much. Thomas told Harold he was sorry for bringing this to his door, told him the police would probably be here soon, told him to tell them the truth about what happened, that he'd been attacked and defended himself. Harold just nodded, didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He'd learned a long time ago that some questions were better left unasked, but Thomas knew he couldn't stay here, couldn't wait for the police to arrive and start asking questions that he couldn't answer. His identity was burned, his face was known to people who wanted him dead, and getting involved with law enforcement would only accelerate the process of being found. He needed to disappear, and he needed to do it now. Thomas loaded the weapons and gear into his truck, working quickly but methodically. He took the rifles, the pistols, the ammunition, the body armor, anything that might be useful. He also took the wallets from the dead men, not for the money but for the identification, the phone numbers, the small details that might help him understand who'd sent them and how they'd found him. Knowledge was survival in his world, and right now he needed every scrap of information he could get. Within 10 minutes of the firefight ending, Thomas was back in his truck, engine running, ready to leave. He looked at Harold one last time, and the old man gave him a small nod, a gesture of understanding between two men who'd both served and both understood what it meant to do terrible things for reasons that seemed good at the time. Then Thomas drove out of the parking lot, heading not toward the highway but into the desert, taking dirt roads that would keep him away from main routes, away from cameras, away from anyone who might be looking for a man in a Ford pickup truck fleeing the scene of a massacre. As he drove, Thomas thought about what Moore had told him before he died. The name Moore had given him was Michael Ashford, a mid-level administrator at a private intelligence firm called Sentinel Global Solutions. Thomas knew the company, had even done a few jobs for them back when he was still operating in the official world. Sentinel was one of those organizations that existed in the gray space between government and private sector, doing work that was too sensitive or too illegal for official agencies to handle directly. They had contracts with the CIA, the Pentagon, various three-letter agencies, and they operated with minimal oversight and maximum deniability. If Sentinel was involved, that meant the order to kill Thomas had come from somewhere high up, from someone with access to resources and information that went beyond normal criminal organizations. False documentation, who could send professional kill teams across international borders without leaving traces. It meant that Thomas's situation was even worse than he'd thought. But it also gave him a target. If Michael Ashford at Sentinel had been the one to coordinate this hit, then Ashford would have information about who'd given the order, about why Thomas had become such a liability that he needed to be eliminated. And Thomas needed that information, because the only way to stop running was to remove the threat at its source, to find whoever had put the price on his head and make them regret it. He drove through the night, putting distance between himself and the Desert Star Motel, his mind already working on the problem of how to get to Ashford, how to extract the information he needed, how to turn from prey into predator. The old Thomas Reed, the one who'd followed orders and did his job and trusted the system, that man was gone, had died somewhere in the streets of Caracas when he'd realized his own people had set him up to be killed. What remained was something harder, something colder, something that understood the only rule in this world was survival and the only question that mattered was who was willing to go further to achieve it. Behind him, in the wreckage of the Desert Star Motel, Harold Vickers was on the phone with the county sheriff, reporting what sounded like a war had broken out in his parking lot. Within an hour, the place would be swarming with police, with federal agents, with investigators trying to piece together what had happened. They'd find the bodies, they'd identify them eventually, they'd trace them back to Sentinel Global Solutions or whatever front companies the contractors had been working through. And then someone, somewhere, would realize that the operation had failed, that Thomas Reed was still alive, and they'd send more people to finish the job. But Thomas was counting on that. He was counting on them being arrogant enough to think that volume would solve the problem, that if 5 contractors couldn't get him, then 10 would, or 20. What they didn't understand yet, what they'd learned too late, was that Thomas wasn't running anymore. He was done being reactive, done letting other people control the game. From this moment forward, he was going on the offensive, and he was going to take the fight directly to the people who wanted him dead. 3 days later, Thomas was in Phoenix, Arizona, sitting in a stolen car across the street from an office building in the financial district. The building was home to Sentinel Global Solutions, among other companies, and according to the information Thomas had gathered through a combination of online research and some carefully placed phone calls, Michael Ashford worked on the 7th floor. Thomas had spent those 3 days preparing, gathering what he needed, planning his approach, making sure he understood the security measures and the potential complications. Getting to Ashford wasn't going to be as simple as walking into the building and putting a gun to his head. Sentinel wasn't some amateur operation, they had security measures, cameras, armed guards, protocols for exactly this kind of situation. Thomas needed to be smart about it, needed to find a way to get Ashford alone, in a place where they could talk privately and where Thomas could use whatever methods were necessary to extract the truth. The opportunity came on the 4th day, when Thomas observed Ashford leaving the building just after 6 in the evening, walking to a parking garage 2 blocks away. Thomas had been watching Ashford's patterns, had noticed that the man always parked in the same garage, always took the same route, always left at approximately the same time. It was the kind of predictable behavior that got people killed in Thomas's former profession, and Ashford was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Thomas followed Ashford's car from a distance, staying back far enough to avoid detection but close enough to keep visual contact. Ashford drove to a house in Scottsdale, an upscale neighborhood where the houses sat behind walls and the security systems cost more than most people earned in a year. Thomas noted the address, memorized the route, then drove away. He couldn't approach Ashford at his home, the man would be too cautious there, too alert. But there were other ways to get to someone, ways that didn't involve direct confrontation. That night, Thomas broke into Ashford's office. It wasn't particularly difficult, despite Sentinel's security measures. Thomas had spent 20 years learning how to bypass security systems, how to move through spaces without being detected, how to find weaknesses in defenses that looked impenetrable. The building had cameras, but Thomas knew their blind spots. It had card readers, but Thomas had acquired an access card from one of the dead contractors at the motel, and while the card itself was deactivated. The RFID chip inside could be cloned and reprogrammed with the right equipment. He made his way to the 7th floor, moving through empty corridors lit only by emergency lighting, checking corners, listening for any indication of security patrols. Ashford's office was at the end of a hallway, a corner office with windows that looked out over the Phoenix skyline. The door had a standard commercial lock, the kind that took Thomas less than 30 seconds to pick. Inside, he found exactly what he'd expected, a desk with a computer, filing cabinets, bookshelves, all the ordinary furnishings of a mid-level executive who ran operations that ended in death and violence but who did so from behind a desk with paperwork and email. Thomas didn't turn on the lights, worked by the glow of the city coming through the windows, enough illumination to see what he was doing. He didn't touch the computer, that would leave digital traces, create logs that would alert security. Instead, he went through the desk drawers, the filing cabinets, looking for anything physical, anything written down, any evidence that would tell him what he needed to know. What he found was better than he'd hoped. Ashford was the kind of administrator who kept physical records, the kind of old-school operator who didn't trust everything to digital storage. In a locked drawer that Thomas opened with a tension wrench and a pick, he found a file folder marked with a code designation that Thomas recognized as the kind of classification used for extremely sensitive operations. Inside the folder were documents detailing the operation to eliminate Thomas Reed, including authorization signatures, budget allocations, and most importantly, the name of the person who'd ordered the hit. Thomas read the name twice, making sure he wasn't misreading it in the dim light. The name was David Brennan, and Thomas knew exactly who that was. Brennan was Deputy Director of Operations at the CIA, a career intelligence officer who'd risen through the ranks by being smart, ruthless, and willing to make decisions that other people avoided. Thomas had never worked directly for Brennan, but he'd encountered him a few times over the years, had been in meetings where Brennan was present, had heard stories about the man's reputation for cleaning up loose ends and protecting the agency's interests at any cost. The document explained everything. The accountant Thomas had been sent to extract in Caracas hadn't just known about cartel operations, he'd known about CIA involvement in those operations, about money that was being funneled through cartels for purposes that couldn't be officially acknowledged. The accountant had been about to expose that information to people who would have asked uncomfortable questions, and so he'd been eliminated. And Thomas, as the person sent to extract him, had become a loose end himself, someone who might have seen or heard something that could connect back to Brennan and his operations. It was, Thomas realized, depressingly predictable. He'd spent 20 years working in the intelligence community, had seen enough operations go sideways to understand how these things worked. When something threatened to become public, when there was a risk of exposure, the solution was always the same: eliminate the threat, tie up the loose ends, make the problem go away. Thomas had been on the other side of that equation many times, had been the one cleaning up the loose ends. Now he was the loose end, and someone had decided he needed to be cleaned up, but now he had a name, a target, a person responsible. David Brennan had ordered his death, and Thomas was going to make sure Brennan regretted that decision. The problem was that Brennan wasn't some mid-level contractor like Ashford, wasn't someone Thomas could just walk up to and threaten. Brennan was protected by layers of security, surrounded by people whose job was to keep him safe, operating out of CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, one of the most secure facilities in the world. Getting to Brennan would require planning, resources, and a willingness to cross lines that even Thomas had hesitated to cross before. Thomas photographed the documents with a camera he'd brought for this purpose, making sure to capture every page, every detail. Then he carefully put everything back exactly as he'd found it, locked the drawer, and left the office the same way he'd entered. By the time security discovered there'd been a breach, if they ever did, Thomas would be long gone, and the only evidence would be some anomalies in the access logs that could be explained away as system glitches. He was back in his car, driving away from the building, when his burner phone rang. Thomas almost didn't answer it, assuming it was a wrong number or a robocall, but something made him pick up. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and disturbingly familiar. It was David Brennan himself. Brennan told Thomas that they needed to talk, that the situation had gotten out of hand, that there were things Thomas didn't understand about what had happened in Caracas. He said he was willing to meet, willing to explain, willing to find a solution that didn't involve anyone else dying. He gave Thomas an address, a time, said to come alone and unarmed, that this would be a conversation between professionals who could work out their differences like rational adults. Thomas listened to all of this without interrupting, his mind analyzing every word, every inflection, looking for the trap that had to be there. Because of course this was a trap. Brennan had somehow found out that Thomas was in Phoenix, had somehow tracked his burner phone, was now trying to lure him into a meeting where more contractors would be waiting to finish the job that the team at the motel had failed to complete. But Thomas also knew that this might be his only chance to get close to Brennan, to end this permanently rather than spending the rest of his life running from one motel to another. If Brennan was willing to meet him, even as part of a trap, it meant Brennan was exposed, vulnerable in a way he normally wouldn't be. And Thomas had learned long ago that the best way to spring a trap was to walk into it with your eyes open, knowing it was there, prepared to turn it against whoever had said it. So Thomas agreed to the meeting. He told Brennan he'd be there, at the address given, at the time specified. Brennan sounded pleased, said he was glad they could resolve this professionally, said he looked forward to clearing up the misunderstanding. Then he hung up, and Thomas sat in his car for a long moment, thinking about what he'd just agreed to, knowing he was probably driving toward his own death but unable to see any other option that didn't involve running forever. The meeting was set for 48 hours later, at a private airfield outside Phoenix, the kind of place where people with money and connections could come and go without dealing with commercial airport security. Thomas spent those 48 hours preparing for what he knew would be either the end of his problems or the end of his life. He acquired more weapons, planned multiple escape routes, studied satellite images of the airfield and the surrounding area, looking for advantages he could exploit. He also prepared for the possibility that he wouldn't survive, recording a video statement detailing everything he knew about the Caracas operation, about Brennan's involvement, about the attempts on his life. He uploaded the video to a secure server with instructions to release it publicly if Thomas didn't check in within 72 hours. It was a dead man's switch, insurance that even if they killed him, the truth would come out eventually. On the night of the meeting, Thomas arrived at the airfield 2 hours early, approaching on foot through the desert, using night vision equipment he'd taken from the contractors at the motel. The airfield was small, just a single runway and a few hangars, owned by a charter company that asked no questions as long as the money was good. Thomas could see lights in one of the hangars, could see a private jet parked on the tarmac, could see vehicles that suggested Brennan had brought security with him. Thomas found a position with good visibility and settled in to watch, to see what he could learn before the scheduled meeting time. Over the next hour, he counted at least 8 security personnel, all of them armed, all of them moving with the practiced efficiency of former military or law enforcement. They were setting up a perimeter, positioning themselves to cover all the approaches to the hangar, establishing firing positions that would give them overlapping fields of fire. It was exactly what Thomas would have done if he'd been setting up security for a high-value target meeting someone potentially hostile. But Thomas also noticed something else. The security was focused outward, toward the approaches from the road and the surrounding desert. They weren't expecting someone to already be in position, already watching them, already inside their perimeter. It was a small oversight, the kind of mistake that happened when you assumed your target would behave predictably, would approach from the obvious direction, would do what he was expected to do. Thomas waited until 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting time, then made his move. Instead of approaching the hangar directly, he circled around to the parked jet, using the aircraft as cover, moving in a low crouch that kept him below the sight lines of the security personnel. When he reached the jet, he climbed the stairs to the cabin door, found it unlocked, and slipped inside. The interior of the jet was luxurious, leather seats and polished wood and all the amenities you'd expect in a private aircraft that cost millions of dollars. But Thomas wasn't interested in the luxury. He was interested in the fact that from the jet's cabin, he could see into the hangar through the large windows, could see David Brennan standing near a car, talking on his phone, surrounded by his security team. Brennan looked exactly as Thomas remembered him, mid-50s, distinguished in the way that senior government officials often were, with silver hair and an expensive suit and the confident bearing of someone who'd spent decades wielding power. He was gesturing as he talked on the phone, clearly agitated about something, and Thomas wondered if Brennan had realized yet that his target wasn't going to approach from the expected direction. Thomas checked his weapons one final time, the Glock in his hand, the knife on his belt, the spare magazines in his pockets. Then he waited, patient and still, watching through the window as the scheduled meeting time came and went. He watched as Brennan's agitation increased, as the man checked his own phone repeatedly, as he spoke to his security team with increasing frustration. Thomas could imagine the conversation. Where is he? Why hasn't he shown up? Do you think he figured out it was a trap? After 20 minutes, Brennan made a decision. Thomas saw him gesture to his security team, saw them begin to pack up their equipment, preparing to leave. Brennan was giving up, assuming Thomas had gotten smart and stayed away, probably already thinking about Plan B for how to find and eliminate his target. The security personnel began to withdraw, getting into their vehicles, starting engines. That's when Thomas made his move. He exited the jet, moving quickly across the tarmac toward the hangar, timing his approach for the moment of maximum confusion as vehicles were moving and people were distracted. He made it to Brennan's car, a black sedan with armor plating and bulletproof glass, just as Brennan was getting into the back seat. Thomas pulled open the driver's door, slid behind the wheel, and before anyone could react, he had the Glock pressed against the base of the driver's skull. The driver froze, hands visible on the steering wheel, smart enough to know that any sudden movement would result in his brain matter decorating the windshield. In the back seat, Brennan looked up from his phone, saw Thomas in the rearview mirror, and for just a moment, his composure slipped, and Thomas saw a naked fear in the man's eyes. Thomas told the driver to start the car and drive, told him to head for the exit, told him that if he did anything stupid or tried to alert the security team, Thomas would kill him first and Brennan second and then take his chances with whoever was left. The driver, to his credit, was professional about it. He started the car, pulled away from the hangar smoothly, drove toward the airfield exit like this was just another routine departure. Behind them, Thomas could see confusion in the security team, could see people realizing that something was wrong, could see them starting to react. But by then the sedan was already off the airfield property, turning onto the road, accelerating away into the night. Someone would try to follow, would call for backup, would mobilize resources to track them down. But Thomas had planned for that, had a route worked out, had contingencies within contingencies that he directed the driver to take a series of turns, heading into an industrial area where warehouses sat dark and empty at this time of night. After about 10 minutes, he told the driver to pull into a specific warehouse, one Thomas had scouted earlier and left a door open for this exact purpose. The driver complied, probably hoping that cooperation would keep him alive, and once they were inside the warehouse with the door closed behind them, Thomas told him to stop the car. Thomas got out, keeping his weapon trained on the driver, and told both men to exit the vehicle. Brennan climbed out of the back seat, straightening his suit jacket, trying to regain some of his composure, trying to look like a man in control rather than a hostage. Thomas told the driver to lie face down on the concrete floor with his hands behind his head. The driver did so without argument, clearly a professional who knew when to recognize a losing situation. Then Thomas turned his attention to Brennan, the man who'd ordered his death, the man responsible for everything that had happened over the past 8 months. They looked at each other across the empty warehouse, and Thomas felt a cold fury settle over him, the same fury he'd felt watching his brother die, the same fury that had driven him on his campaign against the Serpiente cartel all those years ago when he'd been someone else, someone named Miguel Santos who'd also lost everything and decided that revenge was the only thing left worth pursuing. Brennan spoke first. His voice calm and reasonable, the voice of someone who'd spent decades manipulating people and situations to his advantage. He said that Thomas had made things very difficult, that the situation in Caracas could have been handled quietly if Thomas had just accepted his fate, that by fighting back and killing all those contractors, Thomas had created a much bigger problem that would be harder to resolve. Thomas listened to this without expression, without reaction, and when Brennan finished his little speech, Thomas asked a simple question: why? Why had Brennan decided Thomas needed to die? What had Thomas seen or done in Caracas that made him such a threat that professional kill teams needed to be dispatched across international borders? Brennan hesitated, calculating, trying to decide how much to reveal, probably weighing the odds that Thomas would let him live if he cooperated versus the consequences of revealing classified information to someone who wasn't supposed to know it. Finally, he started talking, and what he said confirmed everything Thomas had suspected and added details that made the picture even uglier. The cartel accountant had been working with the CIA on an operation that funneled money through drug trafficking routes to fund covert operations in South America, the kind of operations that Congress hadn't authorized and the public would never approve of. The accountant had been keeping detailed records, had evidence that could expose not just the operation but the people running it, including Brennan himself. When the accountant had threatened to go public, to approach journalists or congressional oversight committees, the decision had been made to eliminate him. Thomas had been chosen for the extraction job specifically because he was expendable, because he'd been in the game long enough that he'd made enemies and accumulated knowledge that made him a potential liability. The plan had been for Thomas to arrive at the safe house, find the accountant already dead, and then be killed himself when the cartel's sicarios arrived moments later. 2 problems solved with one operation, and the deaths would be blamed on the cartel, just another incident in an endless drug war that nobody paid much attention to anymore. But Thomas had survived, and that survival had created complications. He'd become a loose end that needed to be tied up, a witness who might have seen or heard something that could connect back to the operation. So the decision had been made to hunt him down and eliminate him quietly, using contractors who could maintain plausible deniability, who had no official connection to the agency. Brennan explained all of this in the same calm, reasonable tone, as if he were describing a business decision rather than a conspiracy that had left dozens of people dead. He seemed to think that if Thomas understood the reasoning, understood the necessity of what had been done, then somehow that would make it acceptable. He actually suggested that Thomas could still walk away, could disappear permanently in exchange for his silence, could have a new identity and a new life if he just agreed to forget everything he knew. Thomas considered this offer for exactly as long as it took Brennan to finish speaking. Then he shot him. Not a kill shot, but a bullet through the knee, the same shot he'd used on Moore at the motel, disabling rather than immediately fatal. Brennan went down hard, screaming, clutching his shattered leg, all his composure and reasonableness evaporating in an instant of pure agony. Thomas stood over him and told him that there wasn't going to be a deal, wasn't going to be a compromise, wasn't going to be anything except consequences. Brennan had spent decades playing games with people's lives, sending operators into danger and then discarding them when they became inconvenient, hiding behind plausible deniability and official positions while good people died carrying out his orders. And now, finally, Brennan was going to experience what it felt like to be on the receiving end of those decisions, but Thomas wasn't going to kill him. Not yet. That would be too easy, too clean. Instead, Thomas was going to make sure that everything Brennan had tried to hide came out into the open. The video Thomas had recorded, the documents he'd photographed from Ashford's office, all of it was going to be released publicly, was going to journalists and congressional investigators and anyone else who might ask uncomfortable questions. Brennan's career was over, his reputation was destroyed, and he was going to spend whatever time he had left watching his carefully constructed empire collapse around him. Thomas told Brennan all of this while the man bled on the warehouse floor, and he watched Brennan's face as the full scope of his failure became clear. Then Thomas turned to the driver, who was still lying face down on the concrete, probably expecting to be shot next. Thomas told him to get up, told him to take Brennan to a hospital, told him to explain to whoever asked questions that this was the price of sending people to kill someone who knew how to kill back. Then Thomas left. Walking out of the warehouse into the Phoenix night, leaving behind a wounded spymaster and a frightened driver and the wreckage of a conspiracy that would soon be front-page news. He got into a car he'd staged nearby for exactly this purpose, and he drove away, heading not for the highway but for side streets and back roads, routes that would take him away from Phoenix and away from anyone who might be looking for him. Over the next 48 hours, Thomas systematically released everything he'd gathered. The video went to major news networks. The documents went to congressional oversight committees. Anonymous tips went to investigative journalists who'd been covering intelligence community abuses for years. By the time Brennan was out of surgery and under guard in a hospital room, his face was on every television screen in America, and reporters were asking questions about CIA operations that were never supposed to become public. The fallout was spectacular. Brennan was arrested, charged with a list of crimes that would ensure he never saw freedom again. Sentinel Global Solutions saw its contracts cancelled and its executive subpoenaed to testify before Congress. The operation in Caracas and several others like it were exposed, resulting in resignations and reforms and the kind of scandal that the intelligence community hadn't seen since the Church Committee hearings of the 70s, and Thomas Reed disappeared. Not because he was running anymore, but because he chose to, because he'd accomplished what he needed to accomplish and now he wanted to fade back into the anonymous spaces of American life. He took a new name, established a new identity, found work as a mechanic in a small town in Montana where people minded their own business and the past was something you didn't ask about. Sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, Thomas would think about the Desert Star Motel, about the men he'd killed there, about the look in Moore's eyes when he'd realized he was going to die. He'd think about Miguel Santos and Carlos, about the man he'd been when he'd first learned that revenge was just another form of justice when the official kind wasn't available. He'd think about all the choices he'd made, all the lines he'd crossed, all the things he'd done in service of causes and organizations that had ultimately betrayed him. But mostly he'd think about survival, about the fact that he was still alive when so many people had tried to kill him, when everything and everyone had seemed determined to make sure he didn't see another sunrise. He'd survived through skill and luck and a willingness to do whatever was necessary, and now he had something he hadn't had in a very long time, a future that wasn't defined by running or hiding or waiting for the next attempt on his life. The man who'd checked into room 7 at the Desert Star Motel had been running from his past, trying to disappear, hoping to survive just one more day. The man who'd walked out of that warehouse in Phoenix was something different, someone who'd stopped running and started fighting back, someone who'd proven that even the most powerful organizations couldn't eliminate someone who refused to die quietly. They'd sent 5 professional killers to a roadside motel to eliminate a problem. Instead, they'd learned that Thomas Reed wasn't a problem to be eliminated. He was a consequence to be reckoned with, a reminder that some people can't be bullied or threatened or erased, that some people fight back, and when they do, empires fall. In the end, the story of Thomas Reed became another legend in the intelligence community, whispered about in secure facilities and classified briefings. A cautionary tale about what happens when you try to dispose of someone who's spent their entire life learning how to survive impossible situations. Some said he was dead, killed in some operation that never made it into official records. Others said he'd gone deep undercover, was still out there somewhere, still doing the work he'd always done. But the truth was simpler and somehow more satisfying. Thomas Reed was living a quiet life in a small town, fixing engines and drinking coffee and watching the seasons change over the Montana mountains. He was just another face in another crowd, unremarkable and unmemorable, exactly the way he wanted to be. And if anyone ever came looking for him again, if anyone ever decided that Thomas Reed needed to be eliminated, they'd learn the same lesson that 5 professional killers had learned at a roadside motel in Arizona. Some men you can corner. Some men you can trap. Some men you can hunt down and eliminate. But Thomas Reed wasn't one of those men. He was the kind of man who turned traps into killing grounds, who hunted the hunters, who survived because he was willing to do whatever it took and never stopped learning from his mistakes. That he'd checked into that motel alone, just one man against an organization with unlimited resources. They'd sent their best people, their professional killers, their carefully planned operation. And in the end, those killers had checked out in body bags while Thomas Reed drove away into the night, leaving behind only questions and corpses and a growing realization that they'd made a terrible mistake. The Desert Star Motel eventually reopened under new management, and Harold Vickers retired to live with his daughter in California. The parking lot was repaved, the bullet holes in the walls were patched, and new guests came and went without knowing that the motel had once been the site of a battle between one man and an organization that thought it was untouchable. The story faded into local legend, became the kind of tale that people told in bars but didn't quite believe, another piece of mythology in a world that preferred clean narratives to messy truths. But for those who knew, for the people in the intelligence community who understood what had really happened that night, the Desert Star Motel became a symbol. It represented the moment when David Brennan's empire began to crumble, when a conspiracy that should have stayed buried was instead exposed to the light. It represented the cost of treating people as disposable, of thinking that you could eliminate problems without consequences, of forgetting that every operator you train and deploy eventually learns enough to become dangerous. And somewhere in Montana, in a small house on the edge of a small town, a man who'd once been named Thomas Reed and before that had been named Miguel Santos would occasionally remember that night, would remember the sound of gunfire and the smell of cordite and the feeling of turning defense into offense, of refusing to be a victim. He'd remember, and then he'd go back to his quiet life, his anonymous existence, his carefully constructed peace. Because in the end, survival wasn't about winning every fight or defeating every enemy. It was about outlasting them, about being the one still standing when the dust settled, about finding a way to live with what you'd done and who you'd become. Thomas Reed had survived because he'd been willing to become a ghost, to disappear into the spaces between the official world and the underground, to exist in the margins where people like him could finally stop running and start living. The intelligence community learned its lesson, though perhaps not the lesson Thomas would have hoped for. They didn't stop conducting operations like the one in Caracas, didn't stop treating operators as disposable assets, didn't fundamentally change the way they did business. But they did become more careful about who they targeted for elimination, more cautious about creating enemies who knew too much and had nothing left to lose. And every once in a while, when a young operator would complain about their assignment or question their orders or seem like they might become difficult to control, some senior official would tell them the story of Thomas Reed. They'd describe how one man had taken on an entire organization and won, how he'd exposed secrets that were supposed to stay buried, how he'd survived multiple attempts on his life and disappeared into a new identity that couldn't be traced. The story was meant to be a warning: follow orders, don't ask too many questions, remember that the organization will protect you as long as you're useful but discard you the moment you become a problem. But sometimes, a young operator would hear that story and learn a different lesson. They'd learn that survival was possible, that fighting back was an option, that you didn't have to accept your fate just because someone with rank and authority decided you were expendable. And in that way, Thomas Reed's legacy continued long after he'd disappeared from public view. He'd proven that one person could make a difference, could challenge power and survive the consequences, could refuse to be erased from existence just because it was convenient for people with offices and budgets and official authority. It wasn't the kind of legacy you'd find in history books or official records, but it was real nonetheless, passed from person to person in whispered conversations and coded warnings and the occasional knowing look between operators who understood what it really meant to survive in a world where your own people might one day decide you're better off dead. The night at the Desert Star Motel had changed everything, not just for Thomas Reed but for everyone who'd been part of that world, who'd played their roles in the machinery of secrets and violence that operated in the shadows of American power. It had exposed the fiction that anyone was truly protected, truly safe, truly untouchable. It had reminded everyone that consequences existed, that actions had prices, that even the most carefully planned operations could fail if the target refused to cooperate with their own elimination. And so the story lived on, growing and changing with each telling, becoming myth and legend and cautionary tale all at once. In some versions, Thomas Reed was a hero, a whistleblower who'd exposed corruption and saved countless lives by bringing down a criminal conspiracy within the intelligence community. In other versions, he was a villain, a rogue operator who'd betrayed his oath and gotten good people killed because he couldn't accept necessary compromises in the fight against threats to national security. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative allowed. Thomas Reed was neither hero nor villain but simply a man who'd been pushed beyond his breaking point and had responded the only way he knew how, by fighting back with every skill and resource at his disposal, by refusing to go quietly into the darkness, by proving that even in a world of vast organizations and unlimited resources, the individual still mattered, could still make choices that changed outcomes, could still tip the balance between success and failure. He'd checked into a motel alone, a ghost trying to disappear. He'd left that motel having proved he was real, was dangerous, was not to be underestimated or dismissed. 5 professional killers had learned that lesson too late, their lives ending in a parking lot in Arizona because they'd made the fatal mistake of thinking one man couldn't possibly matter against organizational power. But one man had mattered. Thomas Reed had mattered. And somewhere in Montana, living under another name, doing honest work and keeping to himself, he continued to matter. Thomas Reed had mattered. And somewhere in Montana, living under another name, doing honest work and keeping to himself, he continued to live with the choices he'd made and the weight of all those deaths. Years passed, and the story of what happened at the Desert Star Motel took on different meanings for different people. For some in the intelligence community, it became a cautionary tale about operational security and the dangers of underestimating targets. For others, it was a reminder that loyalty was a two-way street, that organizations couldn't treat their people as disposable and expect no consequences. Thomas himself rarely thought about that night anymore. He'd built a new life, one defined not by violence and survival but by the simple rhythms of ordinary existence. He repaired engines, drank coffee at the local diner, watched football on Sundays. He was polite to his neighbors but never got too close. He dated occasionally but never seriously. He existed in that space between connection and isolation, close enough to humanity to remember what it felt like but distant enough to protect both himself and others from the dangers that still lurked in his past. On quiet evenings, when the Montana wind howled down from the mountains and snow covered the ground, Thomas would sometimes pour himself a drink and allow himself to remember. Not just the Desert Star Motel, but everything that had come before. The missions, the operations, the faces of people he'd killed and people who'd died beside him. He'd remember Miguel Santos, the mechanic who'd become a ghost, whose story had somehow become entangled with his own in the documents he'd discovered. Two men, different paths, same fundamental truth, that survival sometimes required transformation, and transformation always carried a price. The intelligence community had changed after Brennan's fall. New oversight, new rules, new promises about accountability. Thomas didn't believe any of it would last. Organizations like that didn't change, they just adapted, found new ways to operate in the shadows, created new plausible deniability. But maybe the exposure had bought some time, had saved a few lives, had made a few people think twice before treating human beings as expendable assets in someone else's game. And in the end, wasn't that all anyone could hope for? Not to change the world, but to make it slightly better, slightly safer, slightly more honest than it had been before. Thomas Reed had survived because he'd been good at his job, because he'd been lucky, and because he'd been willing to fight back when fighting back seemed impossible. The 5 men who'd come to kill him had learned that lesson too late, and their deaths had rippled outward, toppling an empire and exposing secrets that should have stayed buried. He checked in alone to that desert motel, a ghost trying to disappear. They checked out in body bags, victims of their own arrogance and his refusal to die quietly. And somewhere between those two moments, in the violence and chaos of that long night, Thomas Reed had proven that one person could still matter, could still change the course of events, could still make the powerful pay a price for their crimes. It wasn't justice in the traditional sense. It wasn't clean or legal or officially sanctioned. But in a world where the official channels had failed, where the people meant to protect him had instead tried to eliminate him, Thomas had created his own justice. And that justice, written in blood on a motel parking lot in Arizona, had been enough.